I'd like to go through this project with you and work on this photograph that I was about to start to restore this still photograph that came from a movie set when my grandmother was in silent movies. And you may not be able to see very well here. I'll show you the scan. But this is a picture of her on one of her silent movies that she was in. And I don't know the name of the movie. She was in several of them. And it came out of a scrapbook that my mom had. It's got the picture on both sides of one of the scenes from the movie. And I've always wanted to take this and try to restore it into some kind of shape where we could share it as a family. So let's get started in Photoshop. I have already scanned in the image here. And as you can see, it's a rather damaged photograph. I have a large portion here that's missing. A lot of other little spots, a tear. There's a lot of discoloration in the background. You can't hardly see what's going on in some of the areas, so I'm going to spend some time cleaning it up using some of Photoshop's great tools for taking out unwanted damage. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to see whether I have a fairly straight scan, and it looks like I do. If you pull down off of the ruler bar, you can get a guideline. It looks like I'm in pretty good shape both on the top and the bottom, so it's pretty level. And if I pull from the left to right, I've got a pretty clean scan, pretty straight, so I don't have to do any correction there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my crop tool, but I'm going to use the perspective crop tool. And the nice thing about the perspective crop tool is I can select a point, which is, even if it's a little bit oblique, and then I can drag it where I want it to be. And when I get it about the right place, I can let go. Doesn't have to be terribly exact, because what I can do now is I can move it so that it perfectly matches the corners. And so even if there's a little discrepancy on the corner, then I can, and even here I can see this is where it would have originally been. So I'm going to hit enter, and when I do, it cleans off all that stuff on the outside. Now I'm going to go back and add a nice border at the end, but for now I want to have a nice clean image to work with. I also want to make sure I've got the image size proper, so I'm going to go image size, and it's going to be a rather large currently image. I'm going to reduce the image to say 11 on one dimension and 9 on the other, and I'm going to keep the resolution fixed so that the resolution went up to 500, even though I don't need it to be that high. I'm going to leave it there so I don't have to resample, and say OK. And so I've got a pretty nice image here. It's got obviously a few problems. So I want to first color correct. As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm going to use an RGB color correction. So I'm going to first take the background and make a copy of it, so that I'm working on a background copy instead of on the original. And I also want to put a adjustment layer, and the adjustment layer I'm going to use as a levels layer. Now a lot of folks use levels layers, but they usually just use RGB as the way that they make adjustments, and they would pull this slider back, and that does seem to work. However, what I prefer to do to make sure the colors are actually corrected properly, I'm going to go to my RGB slider, pull in my R, change the output level, move it down about 8 on both sides, go to green, I'm going to go kind of quick here because I don't want to belabor this, but you can go back and slow the video down if you care to. And G for blue, RGB, red, green, and blue. Now I've got it officially color corrected. I'm going to change my output level for the blue. I'll get it about where I want it. And now I've got a fairly good representation of what was originally a black and white photograph. And I'm going to hide that. You can see that there's a lot of discoloration on the original photograph, and if I go to the original photograph, you'll see that there's a lot of silver oxide that's discolored the front of the photograph, but we're going to work on that. The other thing I like to do on these restorations is to go to my levels again and change the hue and saturation, just because there's so much going on with color, some blues and some browns, and it just is very distracting. And I like to colorize the image, and I particularly like to use a hue of 41, and I like to reduce my saturation to somewhere between 10 and 15. I'll say 11 or 12. Now you can see that it's all evened out. You can see the hue as you change the slider. The hue changes somewhat from reds to greens to purples, but I like 41. It creates a nice sepia tone, and it prints really well on a black and white or on a Epson 3880 series or the professional series printers. So now I have a neutral sepia tone that I can work from, and I'm going to get started using some of the tools I talked about earlier. I've used the RGB for color correction. I've used a hue and saturation layer for neutralizing the discoloration. And now I'm going to go and take a look at some of the areas that I'm going to clean up. And there's my Nana. She was a interesting person. She starred in a number of silent movies, and her sister starred in more than she did. Her sister starred as Fatty Arbuckle's leading lady on a number of movies, which you can even find on YouTube. My grandmother's name was Frances Mann, and my great aunt was Alice Mann, and Alice Mann was Fatty Arbuckle's leading lady. My grandmother starred in several of those same movies, but she also starred in a number of other ones that are not quite as well known because they didn't include a star as well known as Fatty Arbuckle. So let me get started here, and the first thing I want to do is I want to use the tool I talked about earlier, which is a content aware fill, and I'm just going to use a real quick selection here to complete the crop. There we go. And so I'm going to use the content aware fill, and I'm going to do a quick selection of this little area right here, and I'm going to go edit, fill, and content aware pops up, and I'm going to hit OK. And what it does is it analyzes, oops, I'm on the wrong layer, sorry about that. Edit, fill, content aware, and you can see it fills in the area there with approximation of what it should look like. It's actually not as good as it should be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the selection and I'm going to modify it by expanding it. And I'm going to expand it out 4 pixels, and it's going to pick up some of the pixels around its original selection. And I'm going to select that again. Let me do that again. Select and then modify, expand by 4 pixels. It now picks up some of the area around the area, and I'm going to go edit, fill, content aware, okay, and it does a little bit better job of cleaning that up. So let's just go through here and see what all needs to be done. Now here I've got a kind of a mess on the table, don't I? I've got a lot of papers that are messed up, but they're not very well. They need some cleanup of their own. So I'm going to go in and use the healing brush. I'm going to use a spot healing brush. I'm going to clean up some of these areas on the papers. And all I do is I paint over them, and it magically looks at what's going on, and it'll take out some of the stains that are on the original photograph. And the reason I want to do this is I'm going to use these documents over here as a source document to fill in the area that's been damaged on the left. So I'm going to clean these up, not in great detail, but because I don't want them to look new, I want the photograph to still maintain its original patina and make sure that it still looks authentic. So what I'm going to do here is now that I've got some papers that probably are similar to what was over here, I'm going to zoom in a bit, and I'm going to select those papers, and I'm going to use a selection tool, which is the lasso tool, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to pick up, let's see, I think I might pick up the papers, and I'll clean this up a little bit later. I've actually got that purse in my basement. And I'm going to select the papers. I'm actually going to select a little bit of the desk. And I'm going to hit the Command J, and what that does is, you see over here I've got a layer, and if I look at that layer all by itself, I'm just using the Command J. I've just created a layer that has nothing but the paper on it. So what I want to do is I want to move that layer, but before I move it, I'm actually going to transform it, and I'm going to reverse it. All I did was hit the transform button, and I'm going to reverse that. I'm going to see how this looks. I'm not sure 100% how it's going to look, but we will find out shortly. So now I've got some scattered random papers. Oops. And I'm going to hit the V key for my move tool, and I'm going to move some papers over here to try to fill in what might have been the desk and how it might have looked. And that's not too bad, not too shabby. I'm not exactly sure what it would have looked like, but that's a lot closer than I'm going to try to line up the corner of the desk there so that it looks like the desk is oops, I want to move that layer, I want to move this layer up here. So that's pretty good. Now, what I don't like is the fact that some of this looks a little bit funky, so I'm going to create what's known as a layer mask. And here I'm going to go in the layer mask right here, and layer mask simply is going to allow me to paint out some of the areas that I don't want it to show. So I'm going to hit the B for brush. I want a black brush, and I want to increase the size of my brush a bit. And I've got an opacity on my brush of about 30%. I'm going to change that, hit the 7, and it'll change it to 70%. And now I'm going to paint out some of this right here so I get my desk to show through. And that worked out pretty good. Now I've got some papers that are a little bit scattered on the desk. I didn't want to do that. And let's see if there's any that just look really whacked out of place. Let me see which ones of these. Okay, so I really don't need to do anything in here, so I'm going to use the same layer mask. I'm going to go back to my layer mask, and I'm going to paint out everything over here. So let me go back to my layer mask. And I've still got my brush. I gotta bring the layer back here. And I'm going to use my brush to paint out the flipped over piece. And now I'm just going to show the original that's on here. And I don't want my rip to show. See how the rip's starting to come through here? I don't want it to show. I'm not worried about it yet. What I want to do is I want to, now that I'm painting with black, that's why the rip's showing, I'm going to hit my X key, and you'll see my X key allows the mask to go back to white, and I can come back in here and I can paint in my mask again, give it a little bit of a, so I hope you're following me along this line here. And now I've painted some papers back in, and starting to look like the desk might have looked close to it at least. And don't need that. I'll hit Control Z, take that off. So I got some papers. They look a little bit funky because they're a little bit too symmetrical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the Command T and use a transform tool so they don't quite look as symmetrical. I'm going to move my papers over here a little bit off centered so that symmetry goes away, and I might expand it up this way a little bit, and that's pretty good. And I'm going to then paint in my mask again. Eventually I'm going to get a pretty good picture of what it might have looked like. And once you get this point, I don't want to paint the mask, I don't want to paint the tear back in, so I'm going to X that out and paint back over it here. So now I've got a pretty good little desk. I probably want a little bit of this desk over here to show up over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my patch tool, which I told you about earlier, and I'm going to go to my patch. Over here is the patch tool. And I'm going to select a little piece of this desk. Let's see, I kind of like this little area right here. I don't want the number 27 in there. And let's see how that looks. If I move that, let's see here. Go to my background layer. And I'm going to move that. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this area right here, all the way up to here. Let's see how this looks. I'm going to take my patch tool, move it over here till I get some more desk going. Maybe she's laying her elbow down on the desk there. That sounds like it might work. Yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but So I'm using my healing brush tool now, my spot healing brush tool, and I'm going to clean up some of these areas that are causing some problems. You can see it's creating texture, it's content aware, it's looking at the proximity, and I'm going to go ahead and include all layers. So I'm just going to paint through some of these to start with. And I'm going to alternate between my spot healing brush and my healing brush tool. This will just give me an initial look at what I've got. Because there's not a lot of definition of what was going on in the background, and they used a lot of simple drapes in the back of these shots in the original movies, because they knew a lot of it was going to be, it's starting to come out pretty nice. Looks more like a portrait. Some of these I'll get a little finer. I'm using my left bracket key to reduce the size of my selection. And I'm going to clean up some of these spots that clearly are not part of the original. And these nondescript areas, which are not noticeable, the additional papers that we put on the table here begin to look rather believable, which is kind of nice. I'm going to get rid of the 27. I'm holding down the space bar to move my image around, so it's easier to get to different spots without having to zoom out, zoom back in. So we're starting to look like a pretty good, like a pretty nice little drawing about now. Still has some touch up, but you don't want to get rid of the texture that makes it what it is, which is an antique photograph. You want it to still have the antiquity. And you can see this probably was a cloth background, maybe the kind of painted background like you'd see in a portrait studio, or it could have been a set. It's hard to say because of the damage that was on the original photograph, what was really back there. But in those days they didn't have to have high definition screens, and these little dots pretty much not show. There's still a great deal of clarity in his face and in her face. Rather lovely portrait. Now my grandmother was married to Gardner Porter Johnson, who fought in World War I and was gassed with mustard gas. He only lived to be 42. The gas damaged him. But she stayed in silent films until she was in her 40s. And was quite a strikingly beautiful woman. Started pictures when she was 17 and had 2 children, my mom and my uncle. And I'm about to where I'm not going to do much more on this, because as I zoom out, I have a nice restored photograph. Now what I can do if I want to is I can change the coloration of hue and saturation here. That's what it looks like without any hue and saturation adjustment. Looks kind of yucky. But if I want to change my hue and saturation, I can double click here. I can make it a little bit less saturated to give it a little bit more of a sepia tone, or I can make it more black and white to give it a fairly modern look. I kind of like it around 15. When I print it at 15 on this Epson printer, I get a very, very nice sepia print. I can also change the lightness of it, deepen it, add some contrast if I want to. In fact, I may want to brighten her face up. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another layer, and it's going to be a brightness layer. And this brightness layer, I'm going to increase the brightness, but I don't want it to be bright everywhere. I want to brighten her face up, so I'm going to create a layer mask. And I'm going to fill the layer mask and make it go away by using the paint bucket on it. So now the brightness went away, but I want to increase the brightness on her face, so I'm going to take a paintbrush. I'm going to paint out the mask with a very light opacity of maybe about 20%. A large brush. I'm just going to touch in here a little bit of lightness into her face, just by, you see the mask over here. If I take the brightness away. You can see I've brightened up her face a little bit. And just from that little window right there, you can barely see it. But I can add some brightness to her face, so she has a little glow to her. Maybe to her collar, to the top of her hat. And brighten up her hat. And everything else stays dark. Maybe I want a little brightness on the side of his face. Maybe even a little bit more right there on his side of his face here. Just paint in the brightness. Give it some definition. And now it's starting to look really nice. I really like that. Like a little Rembrandt there. So I can add the brightness where I want to using the brightness mask. Give him a little more highlight in his hair. Add a little glow. Maybe add a glow to the papers. The purse. Maybe some of these papers back here. Give them a little bit more realism. I'm coming off her shoulder. And maybe I even want to darken this even more. So I'm going to darken or add more contrast. So what do we have now? This is how we look now. And if I take away all these adjustments, that's what we started with. So I'd say that's pretty good. We added some corrections. We added some color correction. We added some hue and saturation. And then we filled in a little bit of brightness. We have a really nice image. Now, the last thing I want to do is I want to make this something that I can print, and I'm going to take the image and I'm going to change the canvas side. I'm going to add 1/4 of an inch all around, so I'm going to put 1/2 an inch to the all around. I want it to go all directions. And now I have a canvas that has some additional space. But I've also got a problem because I've now got something showing here I don't want to show. So what I'm going to do is create a selection. Here. Oops, let me go down here to where it's, let me see where that's coming from. That's coming from my additional layer that I created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this layer. I'm going to select everything in here that I want to keep. Try that one more time. Okay, I'm going to invert that selection by hitting Command I. Not what I want to do. Command Z. Command Shift I. Now I've selected just this border right here, and I'm going to hit the delete key. And I just took away that little spot there, and I want to add, I'm going to deselect that, I'm going to add a layer, and I'm going to put it below my drawing, or my painting, or my photograph. And I'm going to fill it, the paint bucket. I'm going to pick a color, probably something like this. Maybe a little bit brighter. I don't want it to be white. I want it to be a little bit aged. And I'm going to now fill, I've got my paint bucket, I'm going to fill this background layer with, that's not quite dark enough. I think I'm going to make it a little darker. There we go. A little darker, and I may even pick the color here to be a little darker than that. There we go, that's better. As Mann restoration. Oops. And I'm going to save it as a Photoshop file. Mann movie. Save. So anyway, now you've seen me take a photograph, and I've gone from this image here, scanned it in, and I've color corrected it. I've taken cloned areas, flipped areas, created separate layers, merged the layers, and my end result is a rather nice restoration, which when printed will be quite handsome, and I can send my brother a copy of it and he'll be thrilled. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Please subscribe to my channel, and if you get a chance, give me some feedback. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you later.